Alright, so this is ARH 304, History of Architecture 4. So, welcome to our virtual lecture. So, for lecture number 1, it is entitled as the Introduction of History of Architecture. And under this topic, there are two subtopics, which is the influence of Philippine architecture and the different era of Philippine architecture. So, for the influences of Philippine architecture, so ang Philippine architecture, it is a mixture of historical and cultural traditions sa aton nga country. So historical siya in the sense nga the historical background of the Philippines nag-influence siya sa design ng aton nga architectural infrastructure or buildings. So kalabanan nga mga structure naton, it reflects the design from the influences of Spaniards, Japanese and American, or even ang mga countries nga ginakuha ta ang mga kalakal tas ang una, like the Chinese, the Indonesian, Malaysian, and other countries nga lapit sa Pilipinas. So by saying naman nga Philippine architecture reflects the cultural tradition in the country. So for example, a typical Filipino house. So kalabanan sa mga Filipino houses, may ara gid sa dirty kitchen. Aside sa ilang main kitchen, may ara pa gid sila dirty kitchen sagwa. So sa iba niyang culture, like sa American, so wala sila nagabutang sang dirty kitchen. So another example is the houses of the Chinese. So may ara silang ginasunod nga feng shui and correct orientation of the house based on their cultural tradition. So same man sa mga Korean houses and other houses nga culture and tradition plays an important role in their architecture. So most prominent historical structure in the archipelago are influences by Austronesian. So by saying Austronesian, it means it is the countries that includes Madagascar, Indonesia, and also the Philippines. Dira nila siya sa sa Austronesian countries, Taiwan, and Pacific Islands of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. Okay, so muna gani ang aton nga mga old buildings, it is protected by the law, mga heritage sites naton, because it not only shows how the early Filipinos designed their buildings, it is also siya gyapon pinapakita iya sa mga old buildings naton kung ano ang mga history nga ginagyan sang country naton. Okay, so during 330 years of Spanish colonialization, so the Philippine architecture was dominated by the Spanish influences. So the Augustinian friars, along with other religious orders, built many grand churches and cathedrals all over the Philippine Islands. So kung makita nyo, damo-damo ng mga old churches kita diri sa Philippines. So it is built during the Spanish colonialization. Sa una, wala pa sa mga architects nga naga-design sa mga churches nga ni. So ang mga pare ni siya ang mga naga-design. So during this period, the traditional Filipino bahay na bato style for large houses emerged. So muna siya ang mga balay nga made of stone ang sa dalomya and then made of light materials ang sa babaw. So these were large houses built of stone and wood, combining Filipino and Spanish and Chinese style elements. So after the Philippines was ceded to the United States as a consequence of the Spanish-American War in 1898, so the architecture of the Philippines was dominated by American aesthetics. So makita ninyo ang kalabanan sa mga government buildings and the other civic buildings ang ipatindog during the American colonial period. So mga siya ng mga classical siya, kaya muna siya ang design again influence ng mga Americans. So in this period, The plan for the modern city of Manila was designed with mainly neoclassical architecture. So muna siyang inambal ko gina. And Art Deco buildings by famous American and Filipino architects. So sa amo ni siya nga time nag joint force na ang Filipino architects and American architects. So diri na guluwa ang mga famous architects. So during World War II, large portions of Intramuros and Manila was destroyed. So ang during this time ang amon siyang Japanese colonial. So most of the buildings nagkalaguba. So many heritage districts in the provinces were burned down by Japanese before the end of the war. So in the reconstruction period after the Second World War, so many of the destroyed buildings were rebuilt. However, a majority of heritage structure, especially in the provinces, were lost and never rebuilt. So most of the structure that were lost are considered as focal properties of formal heritage towns. So kanugon sa mga iba niya buildings sa provinces. Kay wala sila na rebuilt, only the structures nga ara sa city ang gin-rebuild siya during the American colonial period. So in the late 20th century, modern architecture with straight lines and functional aspects was introduced. So particularly in the brutalist architecture that characterized government-built structures done in the Marcos period. So brutalist architecture or brutalism is a French word which means beton brut or raw concrete. So bisan diri sa aton sa Iloilo damo kita di mga buildings nga follows the concept of brutalist architecture. So kung mga buildings na bala nga abin ninyo wala siya natapos kay simento lang siya or abin nyo naubusan sa budget ano pa wala natapos style na siya. So it is called brutalist architecture. So during the presidency of Marcos, so nangutang siya sang kwarta sa ibang country which is sa subong hinabahiran naton. So this budget is allocated for government built structure. So the example is the CCP complex which is built during the Marcos time. So most of the buildings dito sa sulod sang CCP complex, it follows the concept of brutalism. So during this period, many of the older structure fell into decay due to the imposition of martial law. So after the return of democracy in 1986, a new age of Philippine architecture came into focus through modernism. So early in the 21st century, a revival of the respect for the traditional Filipino elements in the architecture returned. So after the martial law, dira na nagguluwa ang mga prominent Filipino architects. So diri na nagumpisa develop ang concepts ng Philippine architecture. So there have been proposal to establish a policy where each municipality and the city will have the ordinance mandating all construction and reconstruction within such territory to be inclined with the municipality or city's architecture and landscaping style to preserve and conserve the country's dying heritage site, which have been demolished one at a time in the fast-paced due urbanization, cultural irresponsible development, and lack of townscape architectural vision. So, damo yun man kita mga heritage buildings sa mga municipalities, mga daan ng mga buildings nga gina-demolish lang. So, kanugon kay this structure is this structure reflects the history nga ginagyan sang specific nga municipality nga ina. So such policies are used by countries that have preserved their architectural marvels and entire cities as a whole for hundreds of years, such as Italy, France, Romania, Germany, and Spain. So makita nyo man dito, no? Kalabanan ng mga buildings dito, which is old buildings nga naging tourist spot na subong. So ang aton diri sa Pilipinas sa Kanugon. Isang una pagustuhan na lang guba sang building mo kay daan naman ko no. Pero ang wala nila gin take into consideration na these old buildings, it is the reflection of our culture. So that is the responsible of the architects nga sa uli dapat kabalo kita kung need ta i-preserve ang isa ka old building or ma-adapt kita dira sa old building para maging adaptive and may concept as a whole ang aton nga design. So the proposal advocates for the usage and reinterpretation of indigenous, colonial, and modern architectural and landscaping styles that are prevalent or used to be prevalent in the given city or municipality. So, muna, no? Pareho diri sa aton. So, ang aton nga indigenous so ang nag-represent sila isang aton nga festivals like the Dinagyang. So it is connected sa aton nga religion. So how can you make a modern architectural concept that connects to the indigenous and the historical aspects of a specific site, for example, here in Iloilo. So muna siya ang challenge sa mga architects sa aton diri subong. So the proposal aims to foster a renaissance in Philippine landscaping and townscaping, especially in rural areas, which can easily be transformed into new architectural heritage towns within a 50-year time frame. So unfortunately, many Philippine-based architecture and engineering experts lack the sense of preserving heritage townscapes, such as the case in Manila, where business proposal to construct structure that are not inclined to Manila's architectural styles have been continuously accepted and constructed by such expert, effectively destroying Manila's architectural townscape one building at a time. So only the city of Vigan has the ordinance on architectural policy, which lead to its declaration as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1999 and awarding of various recognition of the conservation and preservation of its unique architectural and landscaping styles. So mayo lang sa aton diri sa Iloilo kay ang aton nga mga old buildings sa city protected pa siya and ginapanami tapagani siya. So history of Philippine architecture. So the history and culture of the Philippines are reflected in its architectural heritage, in the dwellings of its various people, in churches and mosques, and in the buildings that have been risen and responsible to the demands of progress and aspiration of the people. So architecture in the Philippines today is the result of natural growth enriched with the absorption of varied influences. So it developed from pre-colonial influences of our neighboring Malay brothers, continuing on the Spanish colonial period, the American Commonwealth period, and the modern contemporary times. So as a result, the Philippines has become architectural melting pot, uniquely Filipino and tinge of the Occidental. So the late national hero for architecture, Leandro Locsin, once said that Philippine architecture is an elusive thing because while it makes full use of modern technology, it is a residue of different overlays of foreign influences left in the Philippines over the centuries. So, tsakto no, ang Philippine architecture, wala sang iyagid nga kumbaga iyagid nga tatak. So Philippine architecture is a combination of different influences like the American, Japanese, Chinese, and the Spanish. Okay, so for example, the early Malay culture and the vestige of earlier Hindu influences. So the more than 300 years of Spanish domination the almost 50 years of American rule, the Arab and Chinese influences through commerce and trade over the centuries. So what resulted may have been a hybrid and a totally new configuration which may include the remembrance of the past but transformed or framed in terms of its significance today. So the Philippines architectural landscape is a contrast among small tradition huts built of wood, bamboo, nipa, grass, and other native materials. So the massive Spanish colonial churches, convents, fortification with their heavy earthquake Baroque style. So the American mission style architecture as well as the buildings of commerce with their modern 20th century styles and today's contemporary, albeit modern mundane, concrete structure of the cities. Okay. So ang matawag ta lang gid nga Filipino architecture nga pure is the bahay kubo. Because ang bahay kubo, it represents the culture of the Filipinos. So like the elevated nilang receiving area, tapos sa tupad niya is the kitchen, and may ara siya sang storage for grains sa babaw ya. So it purely illustrate the culture sang Pilipino, kung paano mga buhi sang simple ang isa ka Filipino individual. So hindi lang dira no, so may mga properties man ang bahay kubo nga naga-adapt geographically sa climate kag sa geography sang Pilipinas. For example, ang iyang nga mga columns is made of bamboo, which is the strongest material na maka sustain sang strong winds nga kay tungod ang Pilipinas is often visited by strong typhoons. And also ang iyang roofing materials is made of straws or nipa because ang Pilipinas is also a tropical country kag during summer, so tama kainit ang climate sa Pilipinas. So this materials nagabulig siya para mag-cool ang interior sang bahay kubo. Amo ni siya ang pinaka Filipino gid nga architecture naton nga matawag. So muna nga the bahay kubo is often copied as a concept sa mga buildings nga ginapatindog naton to this present. So during the 19th century, well, the Filipinos built some fine houses, usually with the solid stone foundation or brick lower walls overhanging, wooden upper story with balustrades and capital sliding windows and tiled roof. So muna ni siya ang bahay na bato during the 19th century. 19th century. So the Rizal House in Calamba, Laguna and the Luna House in Badok, Ilocos Norte are good examples. So the city of Manila, Iloilo and Cebu also have some notable old houses. So dala kita no sa ga-preserve sang mga old buildings. So other areas of the country present different forms of tribal architecture as compared to the lowland Bahay Kubo, which is influenced greatly by culture and in some cases climate and the environment. Okay, so the arrival of the Spaniards in 1571 brought in Antillean architecture. So though not specifically suited for hot tropics, European architecture was transposed as Acapulco, Mexico into a uniquely Filipino style. So the style traces its roots from the Antilles in the Central America rather than from the mother Spain. So the Christianization of the islands created the need to establish a religious structure to support the growing number of religious organizations. So though they don't compare with those seen in Europe or in Latin America, colonial churches are unique in their own sense. So some of the best preserved colonial churches in the country are found in Ilocos region, as well as those in the provinces of Laguna and Batangas, as well as the Visayan islands of Panay, Cebu, and Bohol. So diri sa aton, for example, is the Miagao Church. So these colonial churches were typically designed by anonymous friar architects and built between the 1600 and 1750s. So most were initially constructed with bamboo and nipa. But the friars realized that to instill a sense of awe, as well as to caution against the terrible menace of fire and earthquake, more grandiose buildings had to be erected. So diri naging built ang mga churches nga made of stones nga still as a subong ga-exist sila. So in spite of technical and material limitation, they managed to erect massive structure that often took years, even decades to complete, that have survived to the present. So ang mga churches sa una, it is built by Filipino and Chinese master builders. So these craftsmen have sometimes left their native stamp in the decorative motifs. Tropical vegetation of Filipinos, lions and dragon by Chinese. So the churches were built with adjacent convento, which is convento is a priest house and office. Also serve as school, tribunal, prison, and evacuation house during the calamities. So at ang iban nga churches may ara sila sang attached nga belfry and may ara man sang detached belfry. For example, ang sa aton nga Haro Church. So detached ang iyang nga bell, the church bell. So as seen in the Ilocos region, where the belfry was built a couple of meters away from the church structure. So this is the Haro Church, ang belfry sang Haro Church. So many churches are built of successive restoration and renovation projects which superimpose on earlier foundation. So the Spanish colonial period also brought with it military architecture as seen in the fortification they built all over the archipelago. So most of which is Intramuros in Manila. So ang Intramuros, which is literally means within the walls, is a defensive network composed of rattling bulwarks to protect the Spanish city from attack. So ang Intramuros, it is a walled city, no? It is a city within the walls para maging defense nila from the attack of revolutionary Filipinos. So it also contains the foremost military outpost during the Spanish reign, Fort Santiago, named after the Spain's patron saint. So commercial structure which developed only during the latter part of the Spanish period evolved primarily from typical Filipino noble house or the bahay na bato. So the bahay na bato is a derivation of the traditional bahay kubo with more sturdier materials as the main form of construction. So ang bahay kubo is purely made of bamboo and wood and nipa. So gin-evolve na sang mga Filipino during the latter part of the Spanish period. So ginhimo nila nga bato ang sa lower part sang balay para maging sturdier siya. So using the same spatial arrangement of the bahay kubo, the bahay na bato continued the principle of open ventilation and elevated apartments as that of the predecessor. So the only difference being that the bahay na bato, which translate as stone house, is made in most cases of stone instead of more traditional bamboo. So, pero mas mahal pa ganit sa unang mga bahay na bato, no? Kaya ang ilang mga floors is made of Nara wood. So tama na kamahal sa buong Nara. and other species of natural wood, hardwood. Subong yung kalabanan, mas barato pag ani ang synthetic wood gamiton sa mga balay kaysa magamit ka sa natural wood. So other structure developed during the Spanish period were schools and hospital like the Ateneo Municipal, University of Santo Tomas, Colegio de Letran, Hospital de San Juan de Dios. So these are built during the Spanish period. Okay, so the Americans came to the island in 1898. With the arrival of Americans came a new breed of architectural structures. For most of the American contribution to the country was establishment of civil government. So this led to the erection of government buildings from the city all the way to the municipal level. So the government houses dotted every community. So designed in the most respectable manner, these government houses resembled Greek or Roman temples complete with porticos and pediments. So this is a classical type of architecture. So the revival period, popular at the turn of the century, became the foremost architectural parlance of the era as seen in such building as the government post office building as well as the legislative house. So aton ng mga gabaldon sa aton ng mga schools, it is also designed by the Americans during the American period. So the Filipino style found its way in the re-emergence of traditional motifs. So the bahay kubo and the bahay na bato became popular forms to be copied and modernized like the Batasan Pambansa and the Bliss housing projects. So by the 80s, the country's architectural idiom was swept by the tide of postmodernism. So a harkening back of some sort of the romance of classical architecture. So today, architecture in the Philippines continued to be vibrant with the country opening up to the world. So more first-rate architecture is putting in. So this article is from the ncaa.gov.ph or the website of National Commission of Culture and the Arts. So let's move on to the next topic. So the different era of Philippine architecture. So hindi ko lang explain isa-isa kay we will discuss this later on. So first is the pre-Spanish period. So may siya ang architecture before the Spanish came into the Philippines. So next is the Spanish period. So this is during the Spanish colonialization. Next is the American period. And then the post-war period or the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. And then the next is during the 1960s and 1970s. And the last one is the contemporary Philippine architecture. Okay, so that is the lesson for Module 1 or the introduction to the Philippine architecture.